Thanks for joining us at Right On Replicas, where we're proud to bring you the best scale model kit reviews on the planet. This review is brought to you in part by Rogers Hobby Center in Saginaw, Michigan, where the fun begins. This review covers the B-17G Flying Fortress. It's a 1/48 scale kit from Revell, number 85-5600. Now, the B-17 was a rugged, dependable, and heavily armed aircraft that brought many crews home safely. The kit was first produced by Monogram in 1975, and although the molds are a little worn, they're still in pretty good shape. It's skill level 4 for the advanced builder. It has 148 pieces, molded in silver with clear parts, a colorful decal sheet, instructions, and tips on building dioramas. It also features a fully detailed interior, rotating gunner stations, a landing gear, and a 5-member crew at an attractive price. Oh, that's our program director, Newt, knocking on the partition. Looks like he's got a question. Come on in here, Newt. What's your question?
Wow, there sure are a lot of guns on that plane.
That's for sure, Newt. And this plane was designed for non-stop missions into heavy enemy defenses, so it had to protect itself.
Are they still in use today?
Well, not actively, but you'll find them doing demonstration flights and museum displays. And they were a favorite of the air crews in World War II because they had a reputation for taking heavy damage and still bringing the crews home. So there's still quite a few of them left compared to the other types. Here are the contents of the kit. As you can see, they're nicely laid out trees. They're in pretty good shape with very little flash. And of course the clear pieces there on a separate sprue. Now we'll be using liquid cement for the most part, but sometimes super glue for fragile pieces, and some white glue or clear glue for the clear parts too. Remember to use the manufacturer's safety and use guidelines whenever you use any of the products that you see or hear in the review. The decals register very well and they're nicely colorful. They also come off the backing paper nicely and settle down pretty well, but you might want to use some of the decal setting solutions to conform to rivets and panel lines. Start with these parts for the tail wheel and the bulkhead, and remove the flash and seam lines, and the parts aren't too bad, as I mentioned. Now, I painted the parts according to the call-outs in the directions, using either like the Model Master enamels or Tamiya acrylic paints. Next we'll work on the ball turret, so get the two parts here, the clear parts and the gun itself, and then clean those up and paint the gun with some gunmetal and distress it with a little silver, and the ball will have to be masked and painted later with an airbrush. Let's get out the platform for the ball turret and communications section there. That floor piece in my kit was warped a little bit, and it usually they're attached to the parts and the pins that will straighten it out, but I used a little warmer heat gun to warm it up and straighten it out as much as I could before assembly. Now, after painting the parts, I used some Model Master zinc chromate and the Tamiya deck tan, flat black, dark brown, and flat yellow, along with some silver for highlights and the Tamiya brown and black washes. Also a Malta chrome pen for some of the shiny metal pieces. And I placed the decals on the parts as directed. I decided to wait and put the bulkheads or the ball turret into place in the fuselage. That way I'll make sure that it fits properly. I'll get out the parts for the nose gun and clean those up, and we'll paint the gunmetal, place it in the turret, and cover it with the bearing plate. Be sure not to get any glue on the gun if you want it to move. You see here the pieces you'll be using for step 5, and while the airbrush had the zinc chromate in it, I decided to paint all the bulkheads and interior pieces that needed that. So I gathered the parts for the cockpit and the bombardier station, and the parts look pretty good. Just sand the seams and trim any of the flash that you find, and paint up the details using the callouts or reference photos, and here's a close-up for you to see that. Now place the decals as instructed, and I found the pilot and the co-pilot seats were a little wobbly to get true and square, so I glued the legs to the chair before the glue was set then, and glued the legs to the floor, and then kind of situated them so that they were aligned properly and let them dry. Now, the other parts fit pretty well, and the directions have some nice check boxes for construction to make sure you don't miss anything. So there's also an option in this step for the position of the bombardier control yoke, so you need to choose between stored and in-flight position. I chose the stored position, and then I decided to glue the bulkhead in when placing it into the fuselage. Now go ahead and look for the right fuselage half and check it for any warpage, flash, or seam lines, and clean that up, straighten it out if you need to. Well, mine looked pretty good, so I added some Tamiya washes to the interior and detail painting so that it was ready for assembly. Now grab the tail wheel assembly and the small window and glue them into the fuselage. I used Tamiya extra thin to tack the clear parts into place, and then some Textures clear part cement to fill in the gaps. Step 7, we'll use the right fuselage half and the assembly and the bulkhead from step 3. Now glue the bulkhead to the floor, and while it's movable, glue the assembly into the fuselage. Remove paint from any of the gluing surfaces to make sure that they adhere. And grab the 2 wood boxes and small window and glue them into the fuselage. Now paint the boxes in the small window there, and then paint the boxes deck tan and give them a brown wash to bring out the wood grain. I'm waiting for the fuselage assembly now to place the ball turret into position. In step 8, we'll work on the gunner's window and the 2 small windows from the clear sprue and the gun, and paint the gun metal with some silver weathering. Now glue the parts into the front of the right fuselage half. The gun isn't movable when dry, so make sure that you like the placement before it cures. And now look for the sides of the cockpit for step 9 and clean those up. There's callouts for the paint, and glue those to the right fuselage half. Now test fit the clear part into the top of the fuselage and glue it into place. And glue the bulkhead to the rest of the assembly in step 5 and place it in the right half of the fuselage. Well, I waited again to place the nose gun until the fuselage assembles. At step 10, we'll work on the bombs, and also I'm going to put the bombs on the provided cart, and so the bomb bay doors are closed. So other than building the bombs, this step might not be necessary for your build. But clean up the bomb halves and glue them together, and then sand the seams and give them some putty, smooth them out, and then paint them OD green, and the sprinters are brass. Now assemble the 2 halves of the bomb rack, paint it chromate green, zinc, and then with some silver detailing, and glue it to the bomb bay in the right fuselage half. At step 11, work on the left fuselage half, and the instruction shows the front clear parts and the gun going in, but not much else. The written part talks about placing the left parts in, but there's no diagrams. So paint the left side parts as you did the right ones, and glue them into place using the photos here or by matching to the right side. At step 12, we'll be painting the back half of the tail gun, a gunmetal, and then distress that with little silver flecks and glue it to the right fuselage half. In step 13, we're going to work on assembly here, and place the nose turret and the ball turret into the right half of the fuselage. And then when I test fit the 2 sides, if you find any issues, then you'll have to address those so that they fit tight and snug. Now, other than some alignment problems with the fuselage parts itself, I didn't have any problems. So clean the inside of all the clear parts and give them a nice coat of pledge floor gloss. Now glue the halves together in short segments using clamps to ensure proper alignment all the way along the build. At step 14, locate the parts that you see here and get the clear parts out, and then test fit them. And I found the cockpit part to be a bit wide, so I centered it, and I'll have to do a little filling on that later. Now glue the bomb sight to the fuselage after detail painting it, and the bomb sight will be visible through the front of the clear part. And so the other clear parts, they fit pretty nicely and were just glued into place. I then used some assembly clamps to hold the fuselage during assembly and while it dried. Now at step 15, find the right side landing gear parts and the right wheel and wing halves. Remove any imperfections you find, and there's a trademark and a date on the wing, and clean them off and paint them as per callouts on the reference or with reference photos. And I used zinc chromate, a light gray, a rubber black, and flat aluminum. Now after you test fit them, glue the landing gear struts and linkage to the gear well plate. Then glue the gear assembly into the right wing bottom. Now test fit the wing halves and glue them together in clamped sections unless you have enough clamps to clamp the entire wing. So I'll glue the wheel assembly to the gear after the plane's assembled to ensure that it's got a proper flat spot placement to the ground. I'll also glue in the right landing light cover at the final assembly. So step 16 merely says repeat the right wing assembly for the left side using the left wing parts, and I didn't find any issues, so it went together just the same way. And now press the wings into the slots on the fuselage, and then they kind of slip forward into position, and you might have to give them a little extra force there to put them into place. So once they're in place properly, I just wicked in along the edge some Tamiya extra thin cement to glue those into place. So grab the gun and the pivots for the top fuselage area, and then paint that with some gunmetal and silver, a little black wash to give it a highlights. And then we're going to use the clear parts in the antenna up there too. So be careful when you, after the gun is dry, when you're gluing the pivot blocks onto the clear part. Don't get glue on the pivot areas if you want that to move after assembly. And paint the gun, of course, as we noted, and then glue it into the pivot block. And now glue the clear parts and the antenna to the fuselage. Now I'll work on the upper turret there at step 19 and get those parts off the sprues and ready to paint. And of course the gunmetal, the ammo is brass, and the framework for the canopy there is OD green, and then our turret, and then glue the parts together after test fitting. Be sure not to get any glue on the gun if you want it to move, and then place the turret in the top of the fuselage and twist it into place. Don't use any glue if you want it to be posable. Clear up the parts for the waist guns and test fit the clear part there, and then glue the pivot block halves together on the clear part without getting glue onto it if you want the guns to move. Now paint the gun gunmetal and weather it with some silver and glue it into the pivot block. Now glue the assembly to the fuselage and repeat for the other side. Step 21, we're working on the tail gun, so clean the parts up for that and then test fit the clear part in the fuselage. Now test fit the tail piece, and I found that it didn't fit very well and we'll need some filler on the seams. So glue it into place with the best fit and then paint the tail gun and set it aside until final assembly. Now let's work on the horizontal stabilizer parts, and we're going to glue those into the halves after we test fit them. They fit together pretty well, so go ahead and add those. And the parts are side specific, but the tabs and pins should keep you correct. Now make sure that the stabilizers glue horizontally on both sides, and I find a pack of cards to put under the each one helps keep those in position until they dry. Look for these parts and clean them up, the engine, the cowl, and the propeller parts, and test fit and glue the cowl to the engine and repeat 4 times. Now test fit the prop shaft and make sure it spins freely in each engine. Test fit the engines to the wings and glue them into place without getting glue on top of the prop shaft, and then glue the engine side parts and props in later at final assembly. Add the pivot to the left side of the fuselage in front, and the antenna on the upper rear top of the fuselage as well. Step 25, we will work on the bomb cart, and so gather up and clean up the parts and glue the wheel halves together, sand the seam, and paint the tire rubber black and the rim OD green. Now paint the cart OD green and then chip and scratch it with some silver to give it a little more realism. Mist the green with some flat coat from far away and lighten the green so it looks faded and lighter than the bombs. And then glue the wheels to the cart and place the bombs on it. Okay, we're going to embark on painting here, and now that assembly is finished, so you'll need to mask off the clear parts. I used Microscale's Micro Mask for that and applied it with a fine brush and several coats. Then I masked off the landing gear and the wells, and the wing seams and tail seams, they didn't require much sanding and they looked pretty nice. But the fuselage seam was not as nice. I tried to sand the seam carefully between the raised panel lines so as not to lose them, but it was not the result I had hoped for. But it'll have to do. Now decide if you want to paint the model OD green or natural aluminum. I went with the aluminum, and I painted it with a mixture of black and white Stenolris primer to give the finished metallic look a non-uniform appearance. Now I gave the plane a couple of coats of Tamiya flat aluminum, and after the paint dries, I give it a couple coats of Vallejo satin varnish to give it a metal finish and some shine without looking like polished aluminum, and to protect the paint from the masking of the parts for anti-glare, OD green patches, etc., and on the engines there. So now we're going to also mask off the blue tail stripe. After your main color dries, remove the masks for the OD green and the blue tail parts, and now place the decals. There were a few issues, except for the top wing star and the bars didn't want to set properly, even after setting solution. But it didn't look bad after the final coats of satin varnish. They're just pretty finicky. I placed the decals on the props and varnished them as well, after painting the tips yellow and the spinner a blue color. And now we can glue in the remaining parts of the engine and then use some Tamiya brown and black washes to accent the parts. I mixed some Tamiya flat black with thinner with a very thin mix and then made several light coats of the engine exhaust up on top of the wing. And some of the engines, are heavier than others. Now after the weathering, remove the clear parts masks and then paint the landing light wells, the formation lights, the ID lights, and the lights under the plane with a chrome pen. And when that's dry, paint the formation lights with a clear blue paint and the bottom lights clear red, green, and yellow, and glue on the landing light covers. Now glue the tail gun in place, and with the plane on a flat surface, glue the main wheels on and make sure that the flat spots contact the surface well before they dry. Now press the props into position. For the antenna line, I used a black thread and I glued one end of the thread to a toothpick and a weight to the other end of a lengthy piece of thread. Then I coat the thread with some super glue and let it dry. After the glue dries, the thread's stiff enough and can be cut to length and glues easily to the model. I decided to basic finish the figures, and so I gathered those up and cleaned up the imperfections and painted them OD green. And then the undershirts are khaki, the jackets are a light green, and the coats are brown. And I painted the skin a light color with some skin tone shadowing, and then gave it a brown wash to bring out the features, and detailed the straps, the buckles, the dog tags, the clipboards, and the wrenches. There you have it. This model is super size, and I couldn't even fit it in my paint booth. And the shelf's not big enough for it. It's 26 inches wide, but it's really nice, so it's going to be a ceiling hanger. I didn't care for the raised panel lines. There's the modern kits are not like that. But I made it my fuselage seem a little unsightly because I didn't want to lose the detail of the panel lines. So there's a double-edged sword there. Otherwise, you have to use rescribe all the panel lines or use some stretch sprue to try and duplicate them after sanding. But overall, this is a great looking model. It's not a perfect contest model, and some of the seams and things don't fit quite right, but all in all, it's a great replica of the B-17 bomber. And if I were you, I'd buy one and put it on my shelf. Well, we hope you like this premium step-by-step scale model kit review, and so that you don't miss any more, please subscribe to our YouTube channel by clicking on the icon in the lower right of any of our reviews. And you can also find us on Facebook or our website, rightonreplicas.com. Thanks.